perspective. We're looking at it from sociology. What are the kinds of insight, what kind of work and research that's being done? What are the kinds of patterns? Because again, that's what sociologists are interested in. Families, even though there's lots of sort of diversity to families, and we're going to talk about that, there's also some significant patterns. Not everyone kind of does, completely their own thing. And, 8+ billion people on the planet have sort of their own individual set of arrangements. But there's some pretty strong, historical, social, cultural patterns to the way in which families are sort of organized. Yeah, that's not a problem, Anna. Let me upload it again. Um, there we go. Should be coming through now. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at family through sort of the lenses of social science and kind of getting a sense of, even though it's a really rich field and there's, of course, a lot more scholarship than what we can possibly cover in an hour, we're kind of doing an overview and then a slight sort of deep dive into a handful of topics. So I want to start with the idea that the contemporary usually means sort of talking about the current time period. Um, there's some loose definitions on that occasionally, sort of what our contemporary sort of means the last 15 years, the last 30 years, the last 50 years. It depends a little bit on the context. But we're talking about contemporary. We're talking about like what is at play right now. And we know that the contemporary family has significantly more diversity to it in terms of the structure of the family, in terms of how the family is sort of organized than there's been in the past. One of the big changes is what's called the boomerang phenomenon, which means that over 35% of Canadians living are aged 20 to 34 are living with at least one parent. That trend has been going up pretty steadily over the course of the last 3 decades. So we were at just over 30% 25 years ago, and now it's moved into over 35%. Some of that, is would be sort of obvious, even maybe to you now, or be obvious if you've got, for example, some older sort of sibling. But a chunk of it has to do with affordability, has to do with the rising costs, has to do with, some of the difficulties in the field of work and looking and finding and be able to maintain, quote unquote, good paying jobs, so be able to sort of afford one's own household. Another one is changing expectations. There used to be a very significant stigma on the idea of still being in one's parents' household into one's late 20s and then 30s and sort of beyond. There are some not just exceptions, but there are places and sort of course historical time where that was not the case, where children when we're talking about sort of differences, we're talking about sort of the last 20 to 30 years versus sort of the last 50 to 100 years. Obviously, if we go back historically long enough, the idea of multi-generational household would have been much more kind of common. But we went away from that for a significant period of time, talking about the Canadian context, talking about sort of the Western European, North American context, certainly, and then obviously sort of that pattern happening in lots of other places around the world, where there was a push and a dominance for over a century of what's called a nuclear family, right? The nuclear family being two parents and their children. And the household was just that. There is no, aunties or uncles or grandparents sort of living with them. And there's no adult children for the most part coming back, for example, after school or coming back after some period of time spent away and sort of returning. This is increasingly sort of common. Again, I've already sort of mentioned exceptions. There were already some cultures and some places where the multi-generational was always more of sort of a feature. It was always something that was there sort of more along. But even within those who are again living in a North American sort of context, those numbers have gone up. So we're looking at 2.5 million Canadians now that are living in arrangements where it's a multi-generational household. So the boomerang phenomenon, I don't know how many of you are sort of familiar with the boomerang, but the boomerang is sort of this idea, this tool you throw away, you not throw away, but throw, and then it returns to you if thrown properly. It takes a lot of practice, as it turns out. But the boomerang phenomenon is the idea of somebody who's left the house and then comes back. It kind of sort of not fully applies if somebody never leaves. It's not quite the same. It's not quite the same title, but anyway, the boomerang phenomenon is the idea of people leaving, for example, leaving for college or university, or leaving for work, and then circumstances lead them to return to the household and sort of be there. So what we essentially were saying, and I mentioned this, sort of the nuclear family not no longer being sort of the default. There's some really neat graphs. I'm not showing any of them here. There are some in your text that show sort of the growth of nuclear family and so the decrease in nuclear family sort of over time. So it's really kind of interesting to see how families were sort of structured over a 50, 100, 200-year period and how things sort of became in fashion, became dominant, and now again are sort of moving off of being the default. I've mentioned a few, the multi-generational, but there's also cohabitation, blended families, right? Relationships where adults who are coming together and romantic relationships are bringing with them one or multiple children from previous relationship or previous unions. Of course, same-sex marriage now, 21st year anniversary in Canada. I'll talk about that just in a moment. So these shifts, beyond the affordability piece, if we look over sort of a 30 to 40-year period, there's been really significant shifts in terms of marriage, in terms of how many people decide to sort of formally get married. So there's been shifts there. There's been, of course, shifts through the 1980s, 90s, and then early 2000s in terms of women's labor force participation. So that's a number of women who are actively sort of working outside the home, either part-time or full-time. That's changed the sort of the family dynamic. And then broader economic and social transformations, which we've talked in other contexts that are not specifically about the family, but the kinds of things that are also affecting the world of work and things we're talking about when we're talking about social stratification earlier on. One thing your text highlights, and I think is it's a useful sort of taxonomy, if you will, to sort of think about the topic of family. Again, maybe that exact vocabulary is not one you would have used, but sort of will speak to experiences you can I'm sure 100% sort of relate to. There's the family of origin, the family that you were either born into or the family of people who raised you. And sometimes that's multiple families, not just one. That's obviously important to point out. But like the family or families that had a hand in raising you, or raising people, if we're not talking about you specifically, then that's family of origin. And then, of course, we have family of choice, the relationships that somebody decides to form over the course of their lifetime with other human beings. Really, really close friends that they feel like essentially are being given the honorific title of family. Or actual, relationship, a series, an arrangement of romantic relationships that leads to people saying like, this is who I want to live with, this is who I want to form a life with, this is who I want to have children with, families of choice. And so when we're talking about families, obviously there's a really big distinction between the impact that the family had as like a really, really significant, in fact, one would argue the most significant agent of socialization, meaning the family is oftentimes the most consequential influence on our lives, especially early on, especially until we get to sort of the age of 12 to sort of 14, where the impact of the family continues to be incredibly significant, but then it starts to be rivaled by other impacts, the impact of the peer group, the impact of school, the impact of media, that come in and either work in harmony with the impact of the family or starts to create sort of different sets of influences than the family. So that's the family of origin piece, but that's obviously very different than the family of choice, the people you decide to sort of spend time with, you find yourself with, and maybe at least in cases of some people where they become the caretakers, they become the parents, they become that source of influence on the next generation that follows after. So we've got a no, I'm not sharing the right slides. Sharing the partial sets of slides, and I need to be sharing the full sets of slides. So give me a quick second here, a little technical brouhaha. There we go. I've got the right ones in front of me, but it's not really helpful if I'm not sharing the full set with everyone. Okay. I apologize for that disruption. Oh yeah, so I skipped over defining the family. That's okay. We'll circle back and then move forward. Just adapting as we do on this Monday morning. The gist of sort of the define a family, and this is really well discussed in your text. So I don't need to be spending, I think, tons and tons of time on it. But that there is not a universal definition that everybody around the whole world kind of agrees to. I've already hinted at that by talking about sort of honorific title or people sort of, having really close friends and feeling they're part of the family. Um, like whom somebody sort of identifies as sort of like that really kind of core. And also the idea, which, is not going to be the focus of today, but is really worth sort of pointing out, that, family is an overwhelmingly sort of positive things for many people. And then for another set, family has been a source of grief. It's been a source of drama. It's been a source of pain. It's been a source of violence. It's a source of conflict. And it doesn't need to be all or the other. Obviously, there's circumstances where somebody could have, positive relationship with some members of their family and having much more sort of troublesome relationships with other members of the family. So when we talk about family as sort of an idea, when we talk about family as a set of arrangements, it's one that we can have a very sort of narrow vision or narrow definition of it that includes only a very few things. Or we can have an expanded definition of it that ends up being much more inclusive of sort of different kinds of arrangements. So the meaning of family changes across sort of different historical, social, cultural environments. And it's also impacted by the experiences that you have. People, for example, going no contact, people deciding to sort of move away from family, people deciding to sort of, even if it's not a full no contact, having like very significant sort of boundaries that they put between themselves and some members of their family. Like personal experiences sort of shifts, not just what is the family, but the meaning that we attach to family. What I wanted to do here is to highlight the differences between sort of the traditional definition, a definition, for example, that social scientists would have used for a very long time, which is like it's people related by blood or marriage or adoption, usually living together and forming what's called an economic unit, meaning there's sort of like there's one household. They've got some common expenses, and then raising children. That's the definition that was at play when I was an undergrad. That's the definition that was at play for sort of a significant period of time. And then the idea is that over time, there were more and more kinds of arrangements that individuals saw as family arrangements that didn't fit this definition. And the problem with that isn't that okay, well, we need to have a definition that applies to all cases, and we will definitely, a family will mean whatever it means to sort of everyone that's out there. It's not so much that, but if we're social scientists, if we're sociologists, and we're interested in studying society and studying human beings and study how they live their lives and the kind of actions they take and so on and so forth, and large sections, large portions of society, of human beings, are defining family in a different way than what is articulated either sometimes in law, sort of family law that's articulated in different policies, that's articulated in research, then we've got a gap. The definition now is, or this traditional definition was seen as sort of too narrow, given sort of all the changes that have taken place to family arrangements sort of recently. Again, including things like single parents, or including people who are unmarried, including people who choose not to have, or who want to but can't have children. The multi-durational piece I talked about, and then the 2S LGBTQIA plus, who didn't always fit sort of perfectly or at all within the traditional definition. So now the definition that gets more often employed um, is the idea that people living together with commitments, sharing resources, caring for young, and strongly identifying with the group. Um, and you can compare the former to the latter, that now there's a little bit more space for sort of different arrangements. Somebody could still push back and say, well, listen, in this inclusive definition, there's the notion of people living together. Well, not all family members live together all the time. So how do we make sense of that? And we have increasingly arrangements among even dating adults, or frankly, even among married adults, that they each have their own lodging, that they do not live together all the time. Some of that is, long distance and because of work, but there's people who have those arrangements living in the same city. So even this broader definition, which is meant to sort of include a wider array of different family arrangements, will have some exceptions to it of emerging sort of phenomenon. And let's say spouses living in different homes or different apartments, if that grew to be a more significant ratio than it currently is, then presumably over time there need to be another adjustment to that definition to recognize the increase prevalence of this sort of new arrangement. So definitions are like everything else we've looked at over the course of the term, they're context-based. They're about like the usefulness in the moment of understanding like the set of arrangements that are around. If we have a definition that tries to cover every single possibility, then we have a problem because we have a definition that loses sort of much of its meaning because by essentially trying to sort of include everything that's out there, it doesn't allow us to make any distinctions between what is in and sort of what is out, and sort of speak about what like things that are more common, or talk about like increases and decreases of specific forms. But it is important to know that definitions are not static. They'll continue to sort of change and being pushed, and then you'll see that. Okay, so I talked about expanded families. Um, this is where I realized I didn't have the right slides. So Canada has had they haven't been the first, but they've been one of the first countries to extend same-sex family rights and legal recognition. And that doesn't mean just changing the definition of marriage, which happened in 2003 as a precursor to 2005, to voluntary union for life of two people to the exclusion of all others. And then in 2005, Canada became the fourth country to legalize same-sex marriage. But the legal protections have been expanded. It's not just about marriage. It's about rules around divorce, which are separate than marriage, it's a separate set of laws. Rules around adoption, which lagged a little bit, but nonetheless, major changes took place in the decades sort of following 2005. Legal protections for parenting, things around to do with custody. And then, when I say in more, there's things around sort of, healthcare, pensions, sort of benefits, like things that are not sort of purely covered under the instances of sort of marriage, and who each have their own little sort of provisions where this had to be taking place. So again, your text kind of goes into a little bit more detail and speaks about different examples, but that is an example for us of a really significant shift. Um, And now it's been 25 or in the legalization of same-sex marriage, it's been 21 years. So it does feel like it's been in some perspective it's been a long time. And maybe for those of you who are a bit younger, I mean in their late teens or early 20s or mid 20s, this has been how the law this has been what has been in place for as long as you've lived. But those who were a little bit older will remember the fights and the battles, the multi-decade battles that took place. This didn't happen overnight because suddenly somebody said, "Oh, we should look into this." This was sort of a pro camp and against camp that fought it out in the public sphere for an extended period of time. And really, you could go back, to sort of 1950s and 60s, like small traces, but it really kind of picked up steam in the 1980s and 90s. And a sort of multi-decade fight that led to this. And the perception of the Canadian public did shift. There's a couple of different reasons for that. This is a little bit sort of beyond what I can kind of focus sort of in the moment, but in passing, can say that one of the big changes in tracking public opinion on the matter and the increasing support of the population was a if not a necessary, then it certainly ended up being like a really kind of critical factor in this change being adopted. But before that, in order for that change to take place, there was advocacy, but advocacy, I shouldn't say but, the advocacy was really important. But another piece that was really important is representation. And what we'll call now, what's called the normalization of same-sex relationships. I'm talking and referring here specifically to sort of media coverage, but both fiction and nonfiction of having storylines in different shows, in dramas and comedies, having characters having who were interested in one another, were in relationship with one another. The early days of that representation led to an incredible amount of controversy and calls for boycott. And then over time, it became, I mean, and really, it took a chunk of time, again, a couple of decades, that those depictions, those characters, those individuals, celebrities, eventually, that were also out and in same-sex relationship, were interested in sort of marriage, were interested in those rights. There was a normalization of it. And so normalization doesn't mean 100% of the population think it's normal. It's a process by which something goes from being like extraordinary or like, from a pejorative side, like deviant or unusual, to like something becoming like, oh yeah, that's not a big deal. This is just a relationship. It's just a different kind of relationship. It's just two people or so forth. So that's the background, both on the advocacy side and the representation side. Okay. We've got our four or five, sorry, theoretical perspectives. Where is the chat? We have our five theoretical perspectives, functionalist, conflict, feminist, symbolic interactionist, and post-structuralist. They all have something to say about the family. The sections in your text, again, kind of cover that relatively well. I'm just doing an overview here, and in a way, the slides end up being sort of a version of sort of a summary of some of the kind of key ideas that are present in your text. The functionalist perspective, of course, what they're always interested in is what purpose does this serve? What is the family there for? What's really important about the family? So it speaks to, Durkheim, one of the earliest sort of sociologists, spoke to the role of the family and specifically the role of marriage in social unity and social cohesion. It bonded people to one another. It meant that like everyone had a stake in things working out and working well sort of around in broader society because everyone had not everyone, but most people had partners and children, and the idea that the more you're invested in sort of this union, you are invested and it plays a role in sort of bonding you to sort of broader community. Talcott Parsons, which is an American sociologist in the first third of first third to first half of the 20th century. He started to talk about the different family roles. So there's the instrumental and expressive roles, right? Some role of the family is to take care of the young, like support them and provide for them, and making sure that they've got a place to stay and things to eat and clothes to wear, and provide sort of their basic sort of like physical needs. But there's also a really important expressive role that families play, emotional role, emotional upbringing, development of emotional intelligence, caregiving, looking after people, making them feel safe, and hopefully raising them to be, again, from a functionalist perspective, raising them to be contributing members of society, kind of going forward. Um, you have an array of functions that functionalists have identify over time. I've spoken about the socialization. Sexual regulation is sort of like having some arrangement for how kind of people kind of get together. I've talked about support, sort of different contexts. There's a status, sort of, social status that comes with being, a father, a mother, being a caregiver, like that's sort of part of it. But really, the main takeaway is that for the functionalists, like the family has survived, as adapted, but has survived as an institutions for a very, very long time. It's sort of an historical context because it serves some really, really important functions. And so it does certain things that no other institution can play a role of. And when the family doesn't do its sort of basic job an infant and a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, the consequences of that are it's a lifetime of consequences. Meaning, like, the most extreme example of sort of physical and emotional neglect that some children are put through in the first sort of 3 to 5 years of their life. Like in some cases there is no turning back from that. There is no way to completely make up for that. And even in the non-extreme cases, um, people carry with them into their teenage years, into adulthood, throughout their life. Some of those really kind of core fundamental experience from their family, both positive, that's a really good thing, but also negative. That's a more challenging or difficult part. And so family is really, really important. I mean, really, at the end of the day, again, you don't need to hear that from me, but the functionalists sort of the ones who are saying that the most loudly, and who kind of keep pointing out the importance that the family has. And so the studying from that, from a sociologist perspective, is what does that mean? And what are the evolving responsibilities that family have? For example, if there is a boomerang phenomenon, not if there is a boomerang phenomenon, then what are the role of family, not just looking after their children until, the age of 17 or 18 or 19 or whatever it is, but what is the continual sort of role of family? Now, if somebody's in their mid 20s or late 20s or early 30s or beyond, and the job prospects out there, or the affordability, sort of lodging out there, are making it very, very challenging. Like it transforms, or it adds some layers to the family's responsibility in the view of some. For others, they're like, yeah, no, the family has fulfilled its task. It's no longer for family after that to sort of, be invested, not invested, but be like primarily sort of responsible for individuals beyond those earlier stage. Conflict, of course, takes a completely different sort of angle. Um, the idea that like family is a really, really significant mechanism for what's called social reproduction, right? When we talked about social mobility before the midterm, we talked about how, people born in a high level of social stratification or social class versus low, that a lot of these end up being passed down from parents to children, all of these advantages and resources and social networks and cultural knowledge. It means that families relationally, in terms of families compared to one another, or being born in one family versus another, they're sites of inequality. But also, conflict looks at family as a site of inequality in terms of inequality between members of the family. That family historically has mirrored some of the inequalities of broader society. And sort of conflict sort of speaks to that and sort of looked at that and has been doing so before sort of the more contemporary version of the feminist perspective, for example. So that gets us to sort of feminist perspective on families. Again, they were a really early sort of perspective, so sort of highlight the fact that there isn't just one family model out there. That's normal, that there is a plethora of different family arrangements. And so, starting again with sort of I'd say sort of mid 1970s, and really kind of picking up in the 1980s and 90s, there was a lot of sort of writing from the feminist perspective about the variety of family arrangements, and comparing these family arrangements to one another, obviously starting with the gender lens, but oftentimes looking through sort of eventually looking through an intersectional lens. So how does gender and race, ethnicity, and social class and other demographic sort of metrics intersect with one another? Their main kind of piece is that there's no natural quote unquote sort of family, that family are socially constituted. And what that means is that if you look across historical periods or cultural environments, you're going to see many, many different arrangements. And the reason that matters is that there's oftentimes individuals and groups who make natural claims about the family, that it's natural for people to do it this way. This is the normal kind of natural family. And that natural family, that naturalization of one family arrangements ends up being done to say like this is the ideal. This is what everybody should aspire to. And then there's judgment when there's movement sort of away from that. Um, so it really had a really big piece in questioning like taken for granted assumptions around gender roles, again, around gender inequality within the family and around motherhood. Um, the pieces that your text also highlights are around the patriarchy, this notion of how power is distributed in a given society. And so patriarchy is a system that it's something you can use to describe a society if men have an overwhelming amount of the influence and power. We're talking about political power, we're talking about economic power, we're talking about power over the major institutions. So, they're the ones that are in charge largely of, education system, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system. And so their views, their understanding of the world, their perspective ends up dominating sort of decision making, and the allocation of resources. And over time, you have a fraying of that. If you have more diversity in leadership roles, if you have a power that's more shared, if you have a plethora of sort of perspectives that kind of come together and are bringing a different set of perspectives to this allocation of resources and decision making. The gender division of labor is something that they've highlighted. Um, you know, the the household, childcare, home care pieces I'm going to get to sort of a little bit later, but also what's called here the dark side of the family, abuse, violence, including intimate partner violence or domestic violence, sort of domination, economic domination, but also physical dominations. And so the idea that family violence is not a private matter, but it is a social issue, is another contribution from the feminist perspective. So the idea that, you know, households get to run themselves the way they want to, that the way you treat your spouse, the way you treat your children, that is not for the state to be concerned with. The state will get involved if there's a conflict between people from different families or between strangers or between whatever, but it will not meddle in the affairs of within a family, essentially like within the family unit, like the one in charge of the family gets to make the decision. That is how it was for, again, extended period of time, a couple of, I mean, more than a couple of centuries, but even in this sort of quote unquote modern society in the birth of the nation state, the public sector, the government, the state, largely stayed out of family affairs. It largely stayed out of how people are raising their kids. It largely stayed out of what kind of physical discipline, for example, a husband use with their wives that use in terms of disciplining their kids. Like these were not public matters. They're not matters that were criminalized. They're not matters that were for the public or for the state to be involved in. Those laws, almost all of them changed over time, and they changed through advocacy. They changed to saying, like, essentially, there ought to be rules. There ought to be bounds. There ought to be limits on what you can do even within one's home private household. And physical violence, not the only topic, but physical violence is one of those examples of what the limits are and articulating those limits and implementing them and then having a shift from seeing family violence as something that's private to something that's public. So of probably of all the topics we're looking at over the course of the semester, feminist sort of contribution to the topic of gender, which is not a topic we're taking up as a full week lecture, but topic of gender. But of the ones we are taking up, then families and intimate relationship is obviously one where they've had the greatest sort of contribution, which is why I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that here. That leaves us with two perspectives, the symbolic interactionists and the post-structuralists. Again, a reminder that symbolic interactionists are interested in meaning. They're interested in in sort of day-to-day sort of interactions. They're interested in identity. So part of what they're looking at is what are the ways in which, people who are start as strangers who then meet and who, let's say, start to date and become in a relationship, how their view of the world, how their subjective meaning that they attach to like every aspect of the world that's out there, how these become, they become subjects of conversations and discussion. And there's the places of overlap between people who are together, and especially over time, they start to develop more and more of a shared reality. Um, and you're like that meaning making process within families and within romantic relationships is what the symbolic interactionists are interested in. So, in a household, if there is a mom and a dad, or two moms or two dads, do they share, do they share the same perspective as it pertains to, money and allowances, as it pertains to curfews, as it pertains to, what kind of life they want for their children, as it pertains to the broader social world and social issues that are out there. So those are the kinds of things that symbolic interactionists are interested in. And part of that gap, mining those gaps is, or part of that being interested in that topic is looking for gaps. When we talk about, the ways in which sometimes boys and girls and men and women are socialized in different ways, that there's sex segregated spaces. There's spaces that more men occupy, more boys occupy, or some spaces that more women occupy, or more girls occupy. There are the experience that are not always the same because of what we're exposed to, because of friendship groups, because of what we listen to, because of what we read, because of what we do. And it can create this sort of gap in sometimes non-insignificant vision or understanding or perception of social reality. And social media is full of these, of mining that. Either it's a couple that's kind of poking fun at one another because, they have slightly different understanding or ways of doing things, or it's, dating coaches that are out there trying to advise, people, single people, and how to attract people from the other side, and trying to sort of give them tools to bridge that gap, to bridge the gap that they believe may exist between how men and women, or non-binary are interpreting the social world out there. Symbolic contractionists are kind of interested in that whole aspect. And finally, we have our post-structuralists. Post-structuralists are the ones who are most likely to sort of reject essentialism and universalism, to talk about the fact that there isn't, of course, just sort of one family. That's not unlike sort of feminists. You can have this is maybe a useful moment to talk about the fact that these perspectives are not all mutually exclusive. You can be you can be feminist and conflict at the same time, just like you could be feminist and post-structuralist at the same time. Um, it's not always choosing just one, but it's being interested in the kind of questions each of these perspectives raise. So sometimes there's a blending of more than one together. Post-structuralists are the ones who emphasize the way in which, like, family as a concept, as an idea, as a unit, like, is articulated, is mobilized in different ways in different contexts. It's mobilized in particular ways in the court of law, in the system of courts and laws. It's mobilized in a particular way in the field of education. Like, family becomes salient in different ways, dealing with parents, dealing with siblings, navigating that. It's salient in a different way when you deal with health, like in terms of consent, in terms of who needs to be informed, in terms of, family history, in terms of like who's going to be there to help and assist and support and nurture. Like, your family as an idea takes different form across these different sort of fields. And the post-structuralists are the ones who are most likely to highlight that. Queer theory um, is is a post-structuralist sort of approach that really kind of seeks to critique binary understanding of gender as men or women, binary understanding of sexuality, that somebody can, is either just heterosexual or homosexual, and really seeks to deconstruct the boundaries between what is considered normal and what is considered deviant. So it questions these things. We're going to come back to the topic of deviant when we talk about deviance, crime, and the law as our last sort of substantive topic, but I'm going to revisit that sort of at that point. So it challenges this, and it really kind of what it seeks to do is, how are things become normalized over time, and how do things become stigmatized over time, which is the opposite of normalized? How do particular kind of understanding of gender and family and sexuality shift? So when I talked about earlier, talking about media representation and normalization in the context of like depictions, that's the result. Like, the post-structuralists would be the ones doing that kind of study of looking at the depiction of same-sex relationships over, 2 decade, 3 decade, 4 decade, and look at the way in which these relationships were absent or present, and the ways they were present, and how that shifted, both in terms of quantity, but also quality, and in terms of like the ways in which they're depicted over a period of time. That kind of content analysis following representation and depiction. And then mapping that onto, for example, surveys of how people sort of see an issue allows you to make that link between media representation, normalization, and people's attitudes. Um, so it looks at, I've already said this, it looks at law, it looks at policy, it looks, of course, at religion, that in the ways in which they each shape our understanding of what the family is. Okay, so that was quite a bit on these sort of five theoretical perspective. Part of the objective from doing that is we're applying these perspective to one more topic. So it's giving insight into the topic, in this case, families, but it's also trying to get another layer of sort of like understanding for everyone about what distinguishes these perspectives from one another. It is one of the major learning outcomes for the semester is understanding that there's, when sociology, but even social science sort of more broadly, and this applies to lots of humanities as well, but there's a variety of different ways to sort of approach a topic, approach an issue, approach a phenomenon. And the term that's being used here is perspective. And we're highlighting five. It's not that only five exists. It's a first year class. We're not going to talk about 25. Trying to sort of have examine the most significant ones, the one that historically have had the most influence, and the ones that, even if we did look at 15, 20, 25, we could connect a lot of these additional ones back to one of these fives. Trying to sort of give everyone a little bit more information on this. If there's questions, kind of comments or something that's not clear about these perspectives having to do with the family, now would be a good time. The bridge here is to shift from intimate relationship to shift from discussing families to discussing intimate relationships. So this is a good moment just to sort of pause. This isn't our break. We'll break just in another 5 or 10 minutes from now, but just to see if there's yeah, if there's any inquiries that make sense to do before I shift gear. Sometimes it takes a moment for people to type. I will keep an eye on chat, but I also we will do moments of silence for a minute, sort of just waiting for just in case it doesn't come. So there's a lot of discussion so far about like family and the transformation of family and the way in which family can be understood in different ways. Um, and almost all of this applies to sex as well, like sex as in having sex. Um, while the diversity of family structures are impacted by a number of different things that are out there, again, including things like the social, historical, or cultural environment, it's oftentimes not as obvious for people, for everyday Canadians to understand that sex is very much the same way. Like having sex is not just something that's innate. It's not something that people just do on instincts. Not to say there's not a component of that. Clearly there is. But there is a strong cultural context as well. Like sex is also something that's socially constituted. And the reason it's socially constituted is that what is considered sex is not a universal thing. You ask even a cross section of Canadians right now in 2026 what counts as sex, and they don't all have the same definition. They have an array, they have a range. Now, it's not 20 different things, but they have a range of what kind of physical contact needs to have occurred in order for this to count as sex. What is considered normal sex? When is sex appropriate? With whom is sex appropriate? How long should sex sort of last? What's normal? Under what conditions? Is it okay? Under what condition is it not okay? Not only is it frowned upon, but might be outright sort of criminalized. What purpose what are the purpose that are seen as sort of acceptable for sex? So an example would be like, there's judgment around trading sex in exchange for, for access to something, access to a job, trading sex for money, trading sex for food, trading sex for something else. So they're within an historical period, but even within that, within specific cultural and social group, there is a significant layer of cultural meaning that shapes the form and the content and sort of the structure of what is considered acceptable sex. And then there's things that fall outside of that. Again, really, really obvious pieces to look at if this is somehow a little bit difficult or seems a little confusing or a little abstract, things like age of consent. Um, what is the age of consent? Where sort of, where's that? What are the laws? But not just the laws. What are the norms around what's acceptable and not acceptable? And again, the notion of sort of exchange. Another example would be like under what circumstances is like sex as an expression, like because I'm infatuated with someone because I'm like I feels like it needs to happen, or as an expression of love, or within the context of a long-term relationship. Like there's an array of different contexts in which sex is seen as sort of a pretty typical thing. But then there's arrangements that are beyond that, that received various levels of judgment. That some may believe there's no big deal, and others who believe that it is. Casual sex being an example. There's a cross section of the Canadian population that's not into that. And that more than that, that doesn't think that should happen at all, not just for them, but for no one else. No sex before marriage. That's not as dominant as sort of as an ideology around sex as it would have been going back even 40 or 50 years ago, much less before that. But that is still an ideology that's out there. So this all fits under the broader notion of social construction of sex. You don't have to remember Michel Foucault or their history of sexuality, but Foucault, who's a post-structuralist author, and a really influential figure in the social sciences and the humanities. Um, he wrote extensively about that how our understanding of sexuality and sex shifted over time. I'm talking about a hand or a few hundred years. How the idea of what is normal and proper about sex, and what we take for granted today about sex was not always the case. And that historical kind of like trajectory gives us a really kind of nice, clean picture of the impact that that the social, cultural, historical realm has on what otherwise is oftentimes seen as a very kind of like straightforward, natural, biological thing. A few more before break. Your textbook again has a bunch of things on this, sort of developing intimate relationship. It talks about, the notion of sort of romantic love and what is that. Um, and it also speaks about the fact that the ideal of romantic love is not sort of a universal ideal either. It's not like everything I just said about sex, is also true about the concept of love. Like how and much of a role should love play in the formation of families? And for some, it has to be there. There is no forming families, there is no forming relationships without love. Romantic love, understood as like and defined in a particular way. Again, you, me, everybody else we know might be looking for slightly different things. And so we don't need the same sort of set of emotion, the same set of threshold, and these emotions won't be elicited through the same set of conditions. But there might be agreement between a number of us that love needs to be a component. It ought to be there. But that's not the case. It's certainly not the case historically, but it's still not the case in the contemporary world across everyone. Like the emotional connection and mutual care and intimacy, some people see versions of that outside of the context of romantic love. Others see that, like, what we would attach to romantic love is something that can come after, that can be fostered and grow over time, and doesn't need to be the precursor to a relationship or to a family unit. So you have right there evolving sort of set of ideas on how important love is in the in people kind of getting together, quote unquote. Um, that said, I don't want to make it sound like in a Canadian context, romantic love is sort of, one of 18, things that people sort of see as like absolutely sort of critical. It is oftentimes listed at the very top of the list, people that folks are looking for that, and they want that connection. They want that particular connection. They want that spark with someone. They want to be able to sort of feel that and sort of build a relationship out from that. I'm listing here different ways in which in a contemporary world people are meeting. Through family and friends, and out and about public settings and bars and social venues, at school, at work, through church and community groups. All of these have been around for a very long time. They've all been displaced as the number one way in which people meet these days. We're talking about the whole of kind of Canadians who are out there kind of looking for relationships or looking for connections or looking for love, any of the above, by online dating and apps and websites. And there is lots of coverage on that from a media perspective. There's lots of coverage on that in terms of research. There's a really great deal of dissatisfaction with the dating apps and the online dating sort of environment, and frustration from, if not everyone who's involved in there, then most people who are involved in there. And yet it continues to be the principal way in which people are meeting others. And so there has been, including sort of in places like Toronto and lots of places around Canada, there has been like an attempt to sort of recreate and reignite some of the alternatives, that are offline sort of ways of meeting people. And yet it continues, like the online, as I say, continues to be there. So friend, family, and work continues to be important. Um, but the online mix now is sort of at the very top. And in our last slide before a break here, your text talks about, and I've talked about so far, I've been really kind of focusing on, even by default, sort of speaking about a relationship as in between two people. And yet there's a term for that. Of course, it's monogamy. A really often used term is the serial monogamy. Might be somebody who is dating a lot, but it's sort of one at a time, or going out with a lot of people over a period of time, over a few weeks, a few months, a few years, or a few decades, but always sort of in sequence. That's monogamy. But we don't have just monogamy, right? Monogamy is not is and there's this isn't new. Monogamy as something that doesn't work for everyone has been around for a while. But the stigma around other arrangements than monogamy has shifted. And I don't want to overblow it. That is not something that has shifted as significantly yet as, for example, online dating. There was an enormous amount of stigma around online dating, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And that stigma has very slowly eroded to now there is, one would argue, at least in most sort of measures, most metrics, most studies, there is very little stigma. It's not that there's none, but there's very little stigma attached to sort of meeting your partner online, of people like hiding that fact or not wanting to tell their family that, or so on and so forth. Non-monogamy is not anywhere near at that level, but it has softened in terms of the stigma on non-monogamy. There is more depiction, there's more conversations, there are more people out there. Part of that is social media, part of that is content creators talking about non-monogamy, but also there has been more discussion out there about people for whom monogamy does not work, and or at least for a period of time wishes to be in other kinds of arrangements. Infidelity is connected to this, but infidelity is not. Infidelity is where usually there is an agreement or an expectation for monogamy, and yet it does not happen. So there's an emotional or physical behavior that is considered "quote unquote" cheating. It's relatively common. About a third of men, about a quarter of women report what's called extra relational sex. It used to be called extramarital, but it's not just about marriage, right? It's also about more longer term or shorter term relationships. So those are not insignificant numbers. And yet, infidelity continues to be something that's frowned upon. And I'll talk about that when I talk about deviance in a few weeks. What we are talking about in terms of sort of non-monogamy are agreed upon alternative sort of setups where people are in open relationships, people are in polyamorous relationships, people are in relationships where monogamy is not the default, where monogamy is not the only arrangement. And for some, again, for some Canadian, this is something that they explore, and they're in a non-monogamous set of relationships for a while. and then maybe they shift towards monogamy over time. For others, it's the reverse. They may have had a long history of sort of monogamous relationships and then eventually sort of realize it works better for them to be somewhere else, and sort of everything in between. Polyamory, non-monogamy relationships have been and were always a little bit more frequent around same-sex relationships, specifically uh, male same-sex relationship. But polyamory, the idea of intimate relationships involving multiple partners, it's not always sex. It's not always sort of romantic, but usually there's those relationships have this mutual emotional, sexual, and romantic kind of connection to them, emphasizing the kinds of qualities that people are seeking, consent and love and sort of honesty, but keeping that and seeing that as separate, or that monogamy is not the only vehicle that can provide that. So triads and quads and group relationships with various level of commitments. And what that does is that it creates, it highlights the fact that the default wasn't quote unquote working for everyone. And that if there is a broader, diverse array of intimate relationship arrangements out there, then it means that at least for some, if this is consensual and what's called sort of responsible non-monogamy, that are end up being more fulfilling than traditional monogamy. Okay, I'm going to take our break here. It's 10:15. I'm going to shut up until 10:20. If there's questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I will be back in 5 minutes so we can continue the second half of our discussion, talking about marriage, cohabitation, children, and a few other topics. Okay, we are back. Um, we started at the top with the idea that, with the notion that like family arrangements, intimate partner arrangements are shifting or changing. These are all examples of that, right? Talking about the kind of greater openness and also more higher rates of folks who are pursuing non-monogamous relationship. Um, that's an example of family relationships that are changing. Another example is marriage, right? Marriage um, is a very, very, very significant cultural practice. Marriage, the way we understand it sort of today, is, looks quite different. Weddings look quite different, but marriage looks quite different. What is a marriage? What is the family arrangement? What is the marriage arrangement? What are the marriage expectations for, the people who are getting married, for both partners who are in a marriage? What are the reasons that people are excited about marriage, and then what are the kinds of things that come into play that discuss or make it more difficult or more challenging, that make people being unhappy inside their marriage. So marriage is and holds in I don't want to say special role, but it has a very deep-rooted sort of presence in lots of cultures around the world, and has had a very significant role for a long time. And so part of that means that any changes to marriage itself, any changes to the laws around marriage, to the ideas around marriage, to what is normal inside a marriage, people feel incredibly strong about. And there's definitely has been and continues to be a pretty significant cross section of the population. We're talking about Canada, who are concerned about the state of marriage. They're concerned that not enough people are getting married. They're concerned about who gets to get married. They're concerned about like how easy they feel it might be to get divorced. They're concerned about what people do inside those marriages. So when you're talking about human beings and you're talking about the diversity of people that are out there, you're talking about a variety of opinions and perspectives. Part of what we're talking about is how things shift from being sort of the dominant form, the default form, one that's presented as sort of the natural form, the one that everybody should aspire to have, to a sort of a context where there's now, an increasing array of different arrangements. So the stigma around not getting married, it continues to be out there, but it's not anywhere near as strong as it was even a few decades ago or half a century ago, right? Being an older man, especially being an older woman, and being unmarried, um, carried with it a significant amount of stigma, like a lower social status, some shame associated with that. A bunch of different words were coined to kind of speak about those individuals. And while that has not completely disappeared, there has been a really significant shift where there are people who may have wanted the institution of marriage for themselves at a certain point in their lives, but then who may have decided over time that this, it may not happen and it's not for them, and they're at peace with that. There's people who may have wanted it and then it never happened, and they're still kind of quite unhappy and kind of wish that it did. And there might have been some people who, from a pretty early stage, decided that marriage is not, like the institution of marriage is not for them. They may have long-term relationships. Some have decades-long relationship and they never get married. That phenomenon has grown significantly in Canada over the course of the last couple of decades. Russell says, if well, we know whether there's been debate on formally legalizing polyamorous marriages. And more than in most, not all countries, marriage is considered solely between two people. There has been small levels of advocacy. I mean, small in terms of size of level of advocacy, Russell, in Canada for people to kind of push, but it hasn't really gained any significant traction. Meaning, as far as I know, um, there are organizations out there, there are non-governmental organization and advocacy group out there who are pushing for that. But they haven't really been able to kind of gain any major traction in terms of the public sort of support for that, and in terms of sort of politicians and policymakers running on those platforms saying yes, like they're going to support that. They're going to try to introduce a bill for that. Right now, that's considered a political liability, meaning like if you're the support you might gain, and I'm going to make up numbers just for a moment, but the 10 or 12% support you might gain, not by people who are pursuing polyamorous marriage, but those who are supportive of like legal recognition of marriages among more than two people, the support you would gain from that, from a politician's perspective, currently is much, much lower than the risk of the electorate that you would lose by those who are strongly opposed to it. So if polyamorous marriages or polyamorous relationship follow the same pattern as some other family arrangements over the course of the last sort of 20 or 30 years, in terms of like greater depiction in media, in terms of like, high profile, public figures, being in those relationships and talking about being in those relationships, that will go a long way towards softening the stigma. And then that usually it becomes a precursor to eventually people, a greater amount of advocacy and a greater amount of sort of people pushing for that to take place. Um, Fiona says, "What do you mean by same-sex relationships show varied amounts of non-monogamy? Is it more common?" Yes. So the like, without getting too much into the weeds, what I was hinting at there is that within, like, specifically within the male men with men relationship, non-monogamy um, did not have the same stigma, hasn't had the same weight of the stigma. So measuring stigma is something that social scientists will do. There's a bunch of different ways to sort of measure that. Like it's not just whether or not, people are supportive or not supportive, like a thumbs up, thumbs down, but you try to measure like, okay, is this something like you don't have a strong opinion on, or you're very much like in favor of, or a little bit in favor of, or like you're a little bit against it, or you're very much against it. That's one of the measures. Another one is like what is the cost associated with being among or around friends or around family with them? Like, is this a secret? Is this something you're keeping from employers, keeping from friends, keeping from colleagues, keeping from family, or is this something that's sort of known? That's a couple of different ways to sort of measure stigma. So what we've known is that the stigma for non-monogamy, specifically within men's intimate relationships with other men, romantic relationship with other men, is that the stigma with non-monogamy was never as strong. In fact, there's a pretty significant cross section there that embrace various forms of responsible non-monogamy, who talked about like consent, who talked about open communication, and we talked about like we are in a relationship, but it's an open relationship. It's not just the two of us. So there were higher ratios of non-monogamy, and the non-monogamy was in higher ratios, partly because it's kind of chicken and the egg, but partly because the stigma was lesser. So when changes started to take place in terms of a broader array of intimate relationships being sort of considered normal, quote unquote, um, it wasn't the start, but it was another push towards a slight softening, and that's what I would call it, a slight softening of the stigma around monogamy. It's difficult right now in 2026 to sort of say like, the trajectory is back to sort of Russell's point, but combining it with yours, Fiona, to whether to say in 10 years time or 20 years time or 30 years time, it's clear that like, that will like the stigma will continue to soften to a point where it will, the policy will be more reflective and the public discourse will be more reflective and more embracing. But there's been movement in that direction. So yes, more common among same-sex relationships, but specifically among men's relationship with men. I don't have, I don't, I can't right now recall the specific sort of data on women dating women's, the stigma there and prevalence of non-monogamous relationship as versus heterosexual relationships over the course of the last 20 years. I don't have that at the tip of my finger to be able to sort of speak to that. So I have to leave that be. Okay, so marriage. Um, Marriage is a thing, and yet it's something that's transforming. The idea of marriage doesn't have quite the same hold on everyone that it used to have, but it continues to have a really, really major hold. So there's a couple of different categories or term that gets used in social science to speak about marriage. Endogamy, it speaks to the tendency, which is not insignificant, of people marrying within one's own groups. Um, and so that might be linguistic groups, race, ethnicity groups, religion. You're the of wanting to marry or marrying people who share really significant characteristic with us. That's endogamy. Exogamy are marrying outside of one's group. And depending on where that's happening, and again, there's been another, that's the theme of today. There's been shifts. Interracial marriages outright banned, criminalized in a North American context, in through large periods of the 18th and 19th and early 20th century. Um, Even when the criminal statutes are removed, continues to be stigma and social sanctions that lasted for decades longer. Now, is that stigma entirely gone? No, it would be inaccurate, sociologically speaking, to say that that stigma doesn't exist at all. But it is a fraction of what it was. So now the stigma depends on context. In certain families, in certain communities, in certain cultures, there is still pretty significant pressure that says, our preferences would be for our children to date and to certainly marry inside our own group. In some other communities, in some other groups, that has become much less so the case. So this is the dynamic to sort of speak of this is endogamy and exogamy. Elia is asking, curious whether the legalization of polygamy might be affected by the fact that it is specifically outlawed in some places. Not sure it is a verb, and some polygamy was a practice in the past, was outlawed in part due to question whether the wives were taken advantage of. My dad and Emmett. Yeah, I mean, we're the um I'm tempted to sort of go deep and a little bit more, and at the same time, I don't think I can here. This is what I'll say, Elia. It's a very interesting question, and the answer, the short answer is yes. The trajectory of change is that often like practices that were around or around that. Those concerns led to social prohibition, like this is not something that should happen. And in some cases, it led to outright criminalization. So, like something was outlawed. Then once it moved from like it wasn't really done, but maybe it was done by some people, then it became a concern and it was like taboo, and then the taboo turned into a law that was criminalized. The pattern needs to happen in reverse. It goes from being criminalized to like eventually, it's decriminalized. It's no longer something that will be like so same sex was criminalized, was in the statute as a criminal act until I mean in the scope of things until relatively recently. I don't mean to 20, 30 years, but relatively recently. It's decriminalized, but even after it's decriminalized, there's still social sanctions. Whether it's a full-on taboo, usually by the time it's decriminalized, no longer a taboo. Taboo as in like universal sanction, universal social sanction. It's softened. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been decriminalized. But you still have probably large segment of the population who are not on board, and you haven't reached anywhere close to acceptance. But then there's the slow crawl, and it doesn't happen for everything, but there's a slow crawl from like, okay, now there's a little bit more of it. It's not quite as uncommon. Slight sort of destigmatization softening over time. Maybe now it shifts into like a slight normalization over time. And by the time you get to that, then maybe the policy changes that went from something being criminalized to now something being like legally, it's a legal status that's recognized. So you don't go from decriminalized to something being like, yes, you can go to the city hall and get married. You oftentimes for many things, you go from decriminalized to a pattern of sort of social acceptance, and then there's an enshrining into, okay, what are the different realms, including legal, what are the different places where this can be codified? And yes, the resistances in the past, the laws that exist already, it just means that those places are further out. And it's hard to tell in advance whether something will quote unquote progress through these stages will become fully accepted. And first of all, it's rarely full acceptance, but will be accepted by let's say majority of the population, and which ones will run across enough resistance that it will never reach that. It will never get all the way there. I can't say, I mean, of course I'm not here to guess the future, but I don't know whether polygamy will get there or not. It is noticeable the shift in Canadians' attitudes when you're looking at like the whole population now versus 20 years ago, but it's still so far from where these other changes that have been enshrined into law are talking about. Okay, back to marriage for a moment. If endogamy is marrying one in one group, this is different. What's called homogamy, which is choosing partners who have similar values or similar education. Um, so one is meant to be like the endogamy is meant to be on traits that either are inherited or passed on from family or community down to their children. And homogamy are oftentimes things that are understood as being a bit more fluid. So education, okay, like people who are drawn to others who like share similar education or share similar values. Like, yes, those are also passed down from family, but they're seen as sort of more fluid in the scope of things. And so those are, and oftentimes those might be, those are more often decisions that individuals are making. It doesn't mean parents don't put pressure on their kids to marry inside, people who have a certain amount of education and who are a member of particular classes, social classes. Marrying well usually has different meanings, and that may well have to do with education and class, but that's a distinction that's made nonetheless. So partner selections are shaped by all these things. There's lots of research on successful marriages, old research, new research that points to lots of different pieces, but communication between partners, emotional people feeling emotionally supported, um, work-life balance, sustainable sort of arrangements that people feel like happy within for, a long period of time. Those are all tied to what's called marriage satisfaction. Um, a couple of pieces of data about marriage. Um, you've got about 43% of people in Canada in 2021 that are married. If you're talking about all couples, which in many ways is a more sort of relevant sort of statistics in wanting to compare marriage to people who choose not to get married. From the 2021 census, the last census we have, 77% versus 23% choose to marry versus to live in common law. And yet common law has grown significantly. That's in other words, people choosing not to get married has grown by nearly 450% over the 40-year period. So it went from something that was extremely rare. It went from something that, like, over time, going back far enough, people cohabited and maybe lived together a little bit, like as a precursor. Well, first of all, if you go back long enough, people did not live together before they got married. After that, there was a shift where some couples lived together for a little while, as a precursor towards marriage. And then the shift over the course of the last couple of decades is increasingly a high number of couples who, even those who are staying together for decades, are choosing not to get formally married. And so common law in Canada has most of the same rights as a married couples. So there is no, like, financially, for tax purposes, for benefits, for this and that, like a common law union is recognized under the law. And so then the question is raised on, like, what is the true sort of distinction between a common law union and a marriage? It's less than it was, as the legal recognition to common law unions have been expanded over time. There's a strong generational piece there, young adults. People are getting married later in life. Your textbook has some materials on that, but nearly 80% of couples that are in their early 20s are common law. Again, some of them will get married eventually, but we know that the rates of marriage are decreasing each generation, meaning the people in their 40s got married less than the people in their 50s and 60s, and the people in their 30s less, and people in their 20s less. So the trend is towards less marriage, not more marriage. There's so much more to say, but I've got to I have to leave it there. Again, your text has more details. There's also more details beyond that, but the goal always here is understanding of the patterns and the implication of the patterns or the takeaway of the patterns, not the individual statistics. So I'm saying that as I'm about to share more statistics, which is around not having children. Again, a conversation around stigma and expectations. Having children, and the pressure to have children is a real thing. As people get older, they may hear it from their family, from their parents, from their grandparents that want them to have children, and want them to settle down and have children. Like it's seen as like a very significant piece of being an adult is to have children. And you have increasingly in Canada, if we're focused on Canada, people, adults making choices and deciding not to have children. The fertility rate, the number of children per mother, is how this is calculated, fell from 3.8 in 1960 to 1.43 in 2021. This is, of course, below replacement level. You need 2.1 for replacement level, meaning every woman to have on average 2.1 children to be able to sort of maintain your population. And so there's lots of places, including Canada, that are well below that, which is one of the reasons why Canada relies so much on immigration. Because there's just in terms of the way the society is organized, they're not enough people, they're not enough children and younger sort of people from younger generations that are coming in for what is seen as sort of necessary for the kind of economic output support of people who are retirement age and all the other like tax paying in terms of all the different institutions and different services the government and the state needs to run. 34% of the people 15 to 50 reported not wanting to have children. So you're talking about a third. Obviously, 15 to 49, it's not one of those like, well, maybe they'll change their mind later. That's child, at least from the women's side, that's child rearing ages. Reproductive freedom is the idea of the rights to have or not have children. The reasons that are invoked for that 34%, not again that sociologists are asking people to justify their decision as if it's a bad decision, but the things that people bring up have to do with career, have to do with health, have to do with finances, like just the cost of raising children. Increasingly, people are talking about the lack of support. Like it takes a village to raise children, but people are living further away from from their family or they don't have family around. There's not this kind of sort of support network that would be there, but there's also personal preferences. People who delay having children and who love their lives in their 20s and 30s and decide that they want more of this, and they're choosing to have more of this rather than pivot at a certain point and start having kids. The pro-natalist bias, that's pro-natalist is sort of the idea of pro birth, pro having kids, um, is still exists, but it's lessened. It still exists because people oftentimes, especially as they get older, and this is especially true for women, oftentimes are asked, by family, by friends, by coworkers, implicitly, sometimes explicitly, but to kind of, what's going on here? Like, why don't you have kids? To justify like a child-free choices. And then there's labels again to men and women, but we know more of those apply to women empirically, meaning more often women are subjected to this of being called, or being called selfish for having if they've chosen not to have children. Um, so parenthood is still assumed to be the default. And yet, there has been a softening of that. Clearly, you don't get to 30, nearly 35% of people not wanting to have kids without that being a thing. So that dynamic out there, is also has broader impact in terms of society. If everyone is in family arrangements where, there's children involved versus you have increasing size of the adult population that do not have children, then they might be looking for children face spaces for vacation that don't necessarily have children around. There's debates sometimes about whether or not there should be flights that are children free or spaces and public spaces that should not have children. Part of these, and I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying part of this increase in these discussions is because there's a greater, it's not just people who have grown children or now out of the homes, it's because there's a greater segment of the population who have decided and who are without children and who want to be able to experience adulthood, including around other adults, without the presence of children. That's why these conversations come up more than they would have had in the past. Single parents household. I've talked about this quite a bit when we talked about social inequality. It's incredibly connected to, it's a really big predictor of poverty, being raised in a single parent household. There's 1.6 million single parents in Canada, the vast majority of them being women. The causes historically was debt. Somebody, passed away from a disease or passed away at war, man passing away at war. But now it's mostly the main reason is separation or divorce, or parents that were never together to begin with, meaning a child that came out of a more kind of a casual relationship. 15% of Canadian children live with one parent. This is twice the global average, right? So the ratio is just to get a sense here, is what's the number of people who are in single parent household? It's 15%. The fact that the global average is 7 tells you that this is more prominent in Canada, about twice as much more prominent in Canada than it is in terms of the global average. Um, yeah, so I've already mentioned the difficult sort of challenges that are associated with it. I'm not going to sort of push too much more on it, but from the children's side, these are oftentimes this work is done by the folks that are doing developmental psychology and social psychology, and the folks that are doing sociology of the family. Like children on average may experience less effective parenting when there's one parent versus two or multiple parents. There can be reduced emotional closeness. Part of that has to do with time. When you have a single parent, oftentimes like the amount of time that they're available has to be less. The amount of time that a parent is available, full scale is less because of the demands that will be there, including, for example, having a job or multiple jobs. Um, and then more limited access in terms of education tools and educational sort of support. I'll talk to that more when I talk about education in a couple of lectures from now. This is mitigated. These impacts are mitigated if there's other support in the family, if there's other caretakers like grandparents or aunts and uncles, if there's other people that are around, then not all, but many of the impact of sort of single parent households that have been found are lessened significantly. So it's not a, in other words, if somebody is being raised in a single parent household, but there's one or two or multiple other grown-ups that are also involved in raising the kids, then it doesn't have many of these consequences that are found. These consequences are most felt when that single parent has the main slash sole responsibility for raising the kid. Um, the discussion board on families and intimate relationships on Quarkus, I think the very first post, I think maybe from Jerry, if I'm remembering correctly, was sort of on this topic, sort of same-sex family parenting. Um, Oftentimes there is, yeah, there's a lot more that's known now than there was 2 decades ago when I first started sort of teaching on this topic, mostly because there's so many more families out there and same-sex families that are parenting. So you're not kind of speculating or working on really small sample size. About 12% of same-sex couples have children. Um, 80% of that 12% are same-sex women that have these children. Some of these children come from previous relationships. Some of them come from alternative insemination or fostering. Of course, some of them come through adoption after the adoption laws had been changed, no longer to sort of discriminate against same-sex couples. Research has been, even from the early days, but certainly over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, show really sort of a favorable outcome for children from 2S LGBTQIA sort of families. Some of the things that have been found is that there's oftentimes greater equality in terms of parenting and household labor in terms of the parents. But other things that are not listed here. More chances that there's sort of, attuned to emotional intelligence, talking to children about sort of difficult issues, including, for example, they might be from a family arrangement that's a little bit different than quote unquote the typical sort of arrangement. So it means that it's not about perfect, but the data shows that there is more that young children 6 and 8 and 10 have had meaningful conversations with their parents in greater quantity than families that are not same-sex sort of parenting. And that those conversations have led to have good positive outcome with emotional intelligence and empathy, for example. So there is whatever stigma or whatever sort of claims were made that we could not let same-sex individuals from adopting children or having children because if you didn't have a mom or you didn't have a dad in those relationships that will create long-term negative consequences. There is no evidence of that. There are in-depth studies that point to sort of different parenting styles of fathers and mothers. Obviously, there's a huge range within fathers and within mothers, but there's no data that shows that somebody having two parents, two mothers or two fathers, or a mix of parents from across sort of the gender spectrum is creating is creating gaps that are leading to problems later in life. I don't have much time left. There's a topic that I want to sort of speak to, so I'm gonna speed rush through the next two slides as though so I can talk about IPV for a few moments. So your textbook has a whole section on house care, on housework and childcare. The main sort of takeaway there is the notion of the second shift, right? When the household arrangements, the typical one was where women working at home, looking after the home, and the husband or the male partners being out and earning a living. When that shifted with a majority of women being in the workforce, the domestic labor side did not shift in proportional quantity, meaning like women continue to be in 2026, um, but decades after having entered the workforce, continue to take a far greater workload on the house front, on the childcare front. So Ali Hochschild coined the term the second shift to sort of speak of this, the idea that you're spending the whole day at work and then you come home and then there's the quote unquote second job that is there for many women. Um, in terms of the domestic sort of side of it. Egalitarian couples is a term to say where the housework and the childcare are more equally divided. And yet, even in those egalitarian couples, oftentimes women do a little more. It's the difference in terms of the terms between doing 15% more versus doing 500% more. Women with higher education and earnings tend to receive more help from their partners. And in fact, like the sort of the upside or quote unquote good news out of this realm is that the work from Kathleen Gershon and others have shown that there is a really strong generational piece. Young adult, people in their late teens, early 20s, mid 20s, even late 20s now, that many more of them than the generation before them, and that generation, many more of them than the generation before them. So 20s versus people in their mid 30s to early 40s, and then that group versus folks who are in their 50s and 60s. They're much more committed to an idea that the home side is a shared responsibility. We may have different tasks. It doesn't mean everyone does everything, but like everyone needs to pull their weight and not have all of this fall on the one person. So the overall numbers is what it is, but if you cut it up into generations, you see the second shift being markedly less of an issue among younger couples than it is among older couples. And yet it continues to sort of be there. Where I wanted to go and where I wanted to end for today is, transition and problems. That was the last sections of your text. There's discussion in there about divorce and separation, but there's also discussion about IPV. So this is a topic that my own spouse does research on. Not a topic that I was incredibly familiar with, both from personal experience, but also in terms of my own sort of studies. But it is a very big topic that's out there. IPV stands for interpartner violence. It's a term that's hasn't replaced domestic violence, but sort of speaks to the fact that not all of that violence is happening between people who share sort of a domestic household, but it also impact people who are dating, people who are casually seeing one another. So all forms of interpartner relationships. It involves non-physical violence as well as sort of physical assault, emotional abuse. It also involves sexual assaults and harassment and stalking. Um, a lot of IPV is to do with power and control, as to do with one partner sort of controlling and enacting their will on another partner in a way that's abusive. Contributing factors are, economic inequality, gender-based socialization, especially sort of normalization of of like certain forms of masculinity, because the vast majority of IPV, not all of it, but 85% of it, is in heterosexual partnership is men towards women. Um, in terms of a little bit of data, in 2019, 108,000 people in Canada, age 15 or older, experience IPV. The data there that for this particular statistics was 79% were women. In 497 victims of interpartner homicide, that's when there's a loss of life, 80% were women. Self-reported data showed that about 40 to 45% of women say they've experienced interpartner violence. And here the rates is actually the highest among the younger women, among women sort of 15 to 24. Many victims don't report because of fear and privacy, some of the same issues having to do with sexual assault, which we'll talk about when we talk about crime. But really important to connect this back to the discussion of feminism is that there's been a really big shift of talking about IPV as a public issue, not just a private issue. Here's some additional statistics. There's higher rates of IPV among Indigenous women. There's actually a pretty high rates of IPV among LGBT plus sort of women. Children are impacted by this because there's 800,000 children who annually are witness to domestic violence or interpartner violence. And there's a connection there between, of course, the exposure of that, both as children, but also as sort of grown up, but specifically in terms of children with long-term emotional and behavioral issues at school, affecting their future sort of relationship. Of course, in the most severe cases, people are removed from the home into foster care. Your text has details. I wasn't able to sort of, take the extra sort of 5 minutes. I would have liked to provide a little bit more depth here. It is what it is. I spent a little bit more time on the top end. I always share these slides when I talk about this topic. We have Sexual Violence Prevention Support Center here at the university. There's contact numbers and emails if anybody has concerns either about themselves or frankly, people in their family or people they know. And then lastly, here's the lecture reflection for today, 1 minute over time, and I need to apologize for that. But families and relationships are shaped by broader economic conditions and social conditions. Just pick one concept. It doesn't have to be one of those three. Pick one concept from today and try to explain it and how it helps you better understand something you've observed in everyday life. You don't have to talk about your own individual life. You can make it about things you've seen in the media, things you've seen sort of out and about. But that's the reflection for today. That's it. That's all she wrote. We are talking about education next. Sherry's got office hours that are starting right now about the AI assignment. Otherwise, I will see you all on a Wednesday. I'm going to flip to the forthcoming and I'm going to go back to the lecture reflection because I know a lot of you prefer to be able to note that down right away. This is the office hour schedule, the deadline for the AI, and the reading for Wednesday. Okay, thank you, everyone. Cheers. Hope you get to enjoy some sun today. I'll stick around if anybody wants to chat with me. But yeah, otherwise, Sherry is out there, Zoom link for our office hours. Oh, my email? I'll give it to you now. The syllabi is where you could have found it, but there's no reason for me to send you there if I can just type it up. Just give me a quick second here. Here you go. The emails from the TAs are also on the syllabi. You too as well.